It's another sweltering day in Antigua, 1736. We're in the capital city of St. John's, as a large crowd has begun to gather around a commotion in the market square. At its centre, a man is being bound, kicking and screaming, to a great wooden cartwheel. It is a form of torture that resembles a crucifixion, but with some cruel refinements. The victim is now spread-eagled, his body trembling with terror. He writhes against the ropes, twisting in agony, but there is no escape. The executioner, moving with deliberate precision, begins to crush his bones with a heavy iron bar, starting with the feet, then the shins, the hands, the forearms, working methodically inward. The goal is to ensure that the victim remains conscious throughout the procedure, leaving the broken body hoisted upright to die from shock and internal bleeding over a period of hours, or sometimes even days. This was the fate of Prince Klaas on that hot day in 1736, a former Akan chief from the Gold Coast of West Africa, enslaved in Antigua and accused of plotting to massacre every white person on the island. For others like him, the punishment was fire. One witness described how they were nailed to the ground with crooked sticks on every limb, and then the fire was applied by degrees from the feet and the hands upward, burning them slowly until it reached the head, ensuring that their pain were extravagant. What was the crime that warranted such systematic, theatrical cruelty? Rebellion. This was the calculated price of a failed slave revolt. But while nearly all slave revolts were brutally crushed, in more than 350 years, only one truly succeeded. Yet the historical record reveals a bitter irony here. The fate of the world's first Black Republic, the only successful slave rebellion in human history, was in many ways far, far worse. But to understand this calculus of terror, we must first understand the system that it was designed to protect. The economic engine of the Caribbean colonial system was the highly lucrative sugar industry. Colonies like Saint-Domingue, owned by France, and Jamaica by Britain, became the most profitable in the Americas. But this success rested entirely on exceptional brutality and the forced labour of African slaves. The system itself was inherently fragile. In key regions, the demographic imbalance was staggering, often exceeding 10-to-1 ratios of enslaved people to white colonists. This meant that colonies were not stable societies, but what historians have termed a terror regime built on sadist tortures. Violence was not an aberration, it was institutionalized to maintain control. Given the systemic oppression and near constant threat of death or mutilations, you'd think that resistance was rare, but it was surprisingly perpetual. Organised revolts began almost immediately, with the first recorded in Saint-Domingue as early as 1521. Just 2 years before Klaas was smashed to pieces on the wheel, in 1734 a group of British settlers were violently decapitated by rebellious enslaved Africans, a group known as the Maroons. Runaways who had built independent mountain strongholds and waged a guerrilla war against colonial rule. The white planter communities therefore lived in a state of constant fear. They knew that their entire way of life, the wealth, the plantations, the fragile sense of order, was built on a population that far outnumbered them. The same people whose labour sustained their fortunes could, at any moment, rise up and destroy them. And in 1760, in the British colony of Jamaica, that fear finally became a reality. We're now in the beating heart of Britain's Caribbean empire, among the fields of sugarcane and the stench of boiling molasses. A massive uprising has just erupted. Tacky's Revolt, as it would become known, became the most significant slave rebellion in the British West Indies between the 1733 St. John's insurrection and the Haitian Rebellion. It was led by the Coromantee, a proud and warlike people, many of whom arrived in the Caribbean with first-hand military experience, seasoned by years of warfare along the Gold Coast of West Africa. Their leader, a man known as Tacky, was once a tribal chief. Broad-shouldered and dark-skinned, his body was etched with the scars of old battles. In a grim twist of fate that exposed the tangled cruelty of the Atlantic trade, Tacky had once sold prisoners from rival tribes into slavery. Now a slave himself, he would rise to lead a revolution of the enslaved. On April 7th, 1760, the revolt began on an estate owned by William Beckford, a man said to be the richest commoner in all of England. The rebels swept through the estate, overpowered the British forces at Fort Haldane, securing essential arms and ammunition. They overran plantations, they executed European settlers, and grew hundreds strong within a single day. The sheer scale of the revolt rattled the imperial system. The British press didn't treat it as a policing problem, but as a severe imperial and commercial threat. The crisis was primarily financial, marked by the destruction of the plantations and the catastrophic economic losses it entailed. By mid-afternoon the following day, 60 white colonists had been massacred. At Ballard's Valley, the rebels celebrated their success, dancing, drumming, and rejoicing. But the rebels wouldn't celebrate for long. The revolt was swiftly and brutally suppressed by Lieutenant Governor Henry Moore and around 100 mounted militia. Tacky himself was killed about 19 days into the outbreak. The suppression was partly so decisive because of one critical factor. The British were not alone in suppressing the rebellion. You may think that French or perhaps Spanish colonists aided their counterparts, but it was actually the Maroons that aided their company. The Maroons were communities of formerly enslaved people who had successfully established independent colonies inside the island's interior. They were the very same people who had decapitated British settlers on the island some decades earlier. However, their relationship with the colonial powers was ambiguous at best. Following peace treaties, the Jamaican Maroons were contractually obligated to assist the British in recapturing runaways and suppressing new insurrections. The colonial powers cleverly exploited these divisions, offering material rewards to turn one group of self-emancipated Africans against another. It was, in fact, a Maroon, not a British soldier, that killed Tacky. The final cost was overwhelming, borne by the rebels. Approximately 100 white settlers were killed, compared with over 1,500 African rebels. They also captured and resold more than 500 into slavery elsewhere. Following the revolt, colonial authorities unleashed a wave of severe public punishments designed to terrorize the enslaved population and remind them of their place. Every execution, every mutilation was intended as a warning. Resistance would not just fail, it would be utterly annihilated. Over the next month or so, roughly 400 enslaved people were summarily executed. Tacky's body itself was beheaded, and his head was displayed on a pole outside Spanish Town. Others, like a rebel named Abruco, was sentenced to be burned alive. The systemic extension of human pain was an institutionalized part of colonial governance. Colonial administrative records from the time show explicit costs for things like ironwork gibbets, cartridges, labourers, firewood, and other such materials. This was the blueprint for suppressing resistance: overwhelming military force amplified by gruesome public spectacles of torture. For the rebels, it was the price of failure. But what happens when a rebellion doesn't fail? It's now 1791, and we're in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the richest sugar island in the world, built entirely on slavery. Here, in the dead of night, the only successful slave rebellion in the history of the Americas is about to begin. By the late 18th century, Saint-Domingue had become the most profitable colony in the Americas, a distinction achieved through the extreme exploitation of its massive slave population. The revolt began in August, sparked by the French Revolution's ideals and refusal of white colonists to extend rights to African slaves. This complex, multi-sided civil war found its architect in Toussaint Louverture, a former slave turned formidable military strategist. Under his command, the uprising evolved from a desperate rebellion into a disciplined campaign that defeated the French, it defeated the Spanish, and it defeated the British forces, one by one. What began as a series of scattered plantation fires grew into a sprawling conflict, drawing in free people of colour, white planters, European armies, and tens of thousands of enslaved Africans, all fighting for their own vision of freedom, power, and revenge. Entire cities were razed, plantations were turned to ash, and by its end, Saint-Domingue, the jewel of the French Empire, was gone, replaced by something the world had never seen before: an independent black republic. By 1801, Louverture had become Governor-General, abolishing slavery across the entire island and establishing a new constitution that declared liberty for all. But this victory could not stand. In 1802, Napoleon Bonaparte sent more than 20,000 troops, one of the largest expeditions in French colonial history, with explicit orders to restore slavery on the island. After months of brutal fighting and false promises of peace, Louverture was eventually betrayed by his own people, captured and shipped to France, where he died in a freezing cell at Fort d'Anjou in 1803. Yet his vision did not die with him. His lieutenants, led by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, fought on. Aided by the relentless guerrilla resistance and the devastating toll of yellow fever on French troops, they crushed Napoleon's army and achieved what no rebellion in history had ever done: the birth of a free black nation in the Americas. On the 1st of January 1804, Dessalines finally declared independence. The colony of Saint-Domingue was dead. The nation of Haiti was born. The victory, however, was sealed in a horrifying act of revolutionary vengeance. To ensure the permanent expulsion of the colonial threat and prevent the return of the planter class, Dessalines ordered the execution of all remaining Europeans in Haiti. It was a gruesome act, strategically effective in eliminating any threat, but that was immediately seized upon by the pro-slavery factions as proof of the disasters of black emancipation. The international community, dominated by slaveholding powers, responded with overwhelming hostility. The United States, led by Thomas Jefferson, refused to recognize Haiti's sovereignty until 1862. But the ultimate punishment, the most insidious reprisal, was yet to come. It would not be delivered by an executioner or an army, but by a banker. Years later, in 1825, under threat of force from French warships, France demanded an indemnity, a ransom, if you will, of 150 million gold francs. Believe it or not, this payment was framed as compensation, not to the formerly enslaved for their generations of stolen labour and unimaginable suffering, but to the former French plantation owners for their lost property. Facing the very real possibility of renewed war with one of Europe's strongest navies, Haitian President Jean-Pierre Boyer agreed to the terms and paid the ransom, the equivalent of almost $1 billion today, a sum far exceeding Haiti's entire annual revenue. Haiti couldn't possibly pay in full, so it took out high-interest loans from French banks, effectively plunging the new nation into permanent debt. That debt bled Haiti dry, stripping away the resources that could have built schools, hospitals, or infrastructure, and leaving generations trapped in poverty. Its shadow lingers still today. Centuries later, Haiti remains one of the poorest nations on earth, scarred by political assassinations, foreign interventions, cholera outbreaks, and a cycle of rebellion and collapse. Streets once born from revolution still today echo with gunfire and hunger, a nation punished for daring to free itself. And so our story ends where it began, in chains. Not of iron this time, but of debt, poverty, and isolation. The men and women who had torn down the greatest slave system in history were made to pay for their own freedom, punished for daring to imagine equality in a world built for their subjugation. In Antigua, Prince Klaas was broken on the wheel, his followers mercilessly burned at the stake. Tacky in Jamaica was hunted down and beheaded, no less by a former slave. Both died fighting for freedom that they would never live to see themselves. And when that freedom was finally won in Haiti, it was smothered beneath ledgers and treaties instead of swords and fire. The empire no longer needed to kill its rebels, it only needed to make their victory worthless. Haiti's revolution should have been a beacon. Instead, it was turned into a warning. Generations later, the scars remain, a reminder that history does not always reward courage, and that those who rise up from bondage are too often crushed, not by their defeat, but by the world's refusal to let them truly be free. Thank you so much for making it all the way to the end of the video. It amazes me sometimes just how brutal history can be. However, if you enjoyed it, please do consider adding a comment and hitting that like button. It really helps to push this video out to the algorithm. And if you're new here, why not consider subscribing? And you can now hit the hype button, which adds me to some kind of leaderboard. I'm not too sure, but it sounds good and it's free to do. So please do smash that if you can. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.